it's a great honor to moderate this panel of, as you say, of city leaders. We, of course, have our chairman, Anna Mahindra, with us today, as well as Commissioner Amitabh Kant. With us on my left, of course, Antony Vives, and then Meenakshi. It's a great pleasure to have you back home again. And, of course, Artan, we are all, now anxious to experience all of that nightlife of Tel Aviv that you have kindly presented us with. So we will bring you out one of these evenings. How do you see the future, the vision for urbanization for India going forward?
Jonathan, every minute we speak here in India, there are 30 Indians who are moving from rural areas to urban areas. And, if you go by the latest McKinsey study, in the next 4 to 5 decades, you'll see 700 million Indians getting into the process of urbanization. And this really implies that the challenge for India is to create 2.5 Americas by 2050. Now, so obviously India will do more urbanization in the next 5 decades than what it has done in the last 5,000 years. The challenge is that when America urbanized, land, gas, and water were all cheaply available. So America had the luxury of living in New Jersey, traveling to New York, guzzling gas, having limousines, creating cities like Atlanta where 99% of the people travel by car. So Americans created the most polluting cities in the world. We don't have that luxury. So we'll have to create cities which are more compact, which are more dense, which are on the back of public transportation, which are based on recycling of water, recycling of waste, and yet have to be extremely livable. And therefore, the challenge for India really is, and India has been an extremely reluctant urbanizer. But to my mind, that's a huge advantage. The huge advantage is that we must move away from sprawling cities, embed our cities with public transportation, and that requires a lot of money in terms of infrastructure. Do really good spatial planning, but also use technology to leapfrog. And the opportunity for India is that it's the only country in the world with 1 billion biometrics. It's the only country in the world with 1 billion mobile. So virtually, you can manage your cities on the back of good mobile telephony and on a real-time basis. The challenge really is for India, to my mind, is that Indians must learn the art of monetization of land values. Urbanization cannot move forward in India till we do not monetize land value. For every bit of infrastructure that we create, we must learn the art of creating value out of it. That's number one. Number two, I think the regulations of municipalities are very outdated. And because they are outdated, there's no concept of special purpose vehicles which will enable you to do that monetization. So every new urbanization process that is done under the 74th Amendment, under a provision called 243Q, which has enabled you to create industrial cities. And to my mind, it's not possible for government to create or do all urbanization in the future. And if government does it, it'll do shoddy urbanization. So the important thing is that it must delegate, decentralize, and allow a much greater level of private sector play in the process of urbanization. And this would necessitate some legislative changes which will enable private sector to pool land, to do their own master planning, to do their own trunk infrastructure, and to be able to monetize land values and create cities of the future. That's one. Number two is, on the existing cities, I think there's a huge challenge about raising revenues by enhancing tariffs. There are cities in India, there's huge civilizational cities like India, like Varanasi, where water rates and electricity bills haven't been raised for the last 2 decades. I mean, you can't run a city till you don't charge market prices. And therefore, people are dying for good services. They want to pay the price, they want to pay, they want cities to be better managed. And therefore, it's necessary that services are provided at the right market prices. So the challenge for India has just begun, and it's important that we do it on the back of good planning, on the back of good legislation, on the back of good technology, on the back of good public transportation, and on the back of good recycling of water and good recycling of waste, which will enable better livability. I'm not touching on creativity, I'm not talking about culture, which are very essential component of great living. But for India right now is quality of infrastructure, which is critical.
Thank you. And if I could turn, building on a bit of what Amitabh was just saying, so you spoke a lot about the creativity of Tel Aviv and sort of the spirit. How do we make that link from creativity and culture and heritage to the quality of infrastructure, the actual or economic quality, economic development, and what is Tel Aviv doing to make that connection? Sort of how does all of this creativity actually help improve the quality of infrastructure and the quality of the city and its economy?
Well, if I may, actually, it was the reverse. Tel Aviv in the 1980s was on the verge of bankruptcy. The infrastructure was rotten. Nothing worked. The city was in debt. And the decision that the city made, and of course the young people left. When you formed the family, you would leave, and only really old populations remained in Tel Aviv, or lower income populations. And it is the center of the country. I mean, the basic assets are all there. It was just mismanagement of the funding and a lack of investment. And the city made a decision 15 years ago to reinvest in the infrastructure, and essentially for 5 to 7 years, probably I would say the mayor, who's been mayor for 18 years, was the most hated person in the city, because everybody had a grievance with the mayor one way or another. Their road was blocked, the road was open, something wasn't functioning, but he said, guys, patience. It needs patience. It's not a quick win. We have to redo everything. When the infrastructure was improved, when the cities became livable, fun, safe, walkable, people started returning. So the creativity came the other way around. It was always the artistic center of Israel. It was always a cultural center, but there was something about when the city became much more livable that people started returning. And I'll say one thing about the city, because it's so small and it's very walkable, we walk everywhere. And that's really one thing that to me is very apparent, but again, it's a totally different culture. We walk everywhere, and everything happens in the street. I reached the point where I'm about to sell my car. I don't want it. I don't need it. I walk to work. If it's a bit more of a distance, I take a bicycle. We're now introducing a car sharing program. I don't want to have a car. There's no need for me to have a car. Having a car is selfish. I'm taking up the space with one car of so many people or bicycles that could be on the road, and there's no reason to have it. But that's a luxury you can have in a small city. But it's also a luxury you can have when walking on the street is so fun, and knowing that you're going to meet people on the street is so fun, and it's a safe street to walk on. That's when creative people start returning to the cities, and that's what happened in the city of Tel Aviv.
One of the other things that we're here at the Mahindra World City, but we're also, as I said, in the era of deglobalization, as people say, or this economic nationalism. How do these things go together? Or what is your vision for the relevance of globalization in the context of what appear to be a lot of cross currents, a lot of turbulence, a lot of people saying we want less globalization?
One of the reasons I'm very allergic to coming on a panel with Amitabh is he usually leaves you with nothing to say when he's done. And I do agree with a lot of what he says. Two of the points that he stressed on, I'm going to expand on, and that was really about decentralization. That was one of the themes that ran across his comments. And empowerment. He talked about private participation. I don't think he meant the corporate sector in a sense, but it was about empowerment of people. So to go back to your question, Jonathan, it's not so much deglobalization that worries me. I could go on about deglobalization and what the world according to Trump might mean, and I think I'll skip that now. I think the real trend we have to watch out for is the death of the megalopolis. That concept, to my mind, has to be put to rest. Somehow, as we went past when we went through the past decades, the model was that the city is what made a country productive. You got enormous gains in productivity when you moved from rural areas to cities. Urbanization is what caused modernity. If you look back, there was no productivity gains for decades and for centuries sometimes in rural cities. It was urbanization that created productivity. And the larger the city became, the more productive you were. Somehow that model is broken. You alluded to it a lot in your opening comments. First of all, keeping up with infrastructure needs is becoming impossible. Keeping up with rural-urban migration is becoming an enormous social problem. And we're not China. We don't run like China where you can flick a switch and tell people you will move in this month from the countryside to the city and back. So rural-urban migration in India is a problem that cannot be sorted out the way China has done. When you look at economically what's happening to cities, frankly speaking, infrastructure itself is breaking down the productivity gains. The Gini coefficient, in fact, has become worse in cities with globalization. So you're getting divisions into ghettos, which are dividing people apart. And the social pressures where people are losing a sense of identity and community is breaking identities apart. So I'm afraid nothing is working. One of the things I wrote about, in fact, in a recent McKinsey publication was that we have to reimagine how India is going to urbanize. And we have to use that concept of decentralization. So rather than imagining the world as a network of megalopolises, New York connected to London, to Tel Aviv, to Paris, and that's what the vision of our world is. I think first of all in India we've got to realize our goal is not to create those kind of urban agglomerations which will match up to the mega cities of the future. We have to decentralize. So what happens to productivity then? Are we going to give that up? Well, that's where I think the death of distance, as Francis Cairncross put it so eloquently, comes to our aid. You don't have to sacrifice productivity anymore. Digital technologies and communication allow you, if you're sitting in a village, using 3D printing technology, you can manufacture automotive parts for my vehicles, which, by the way, I keep hoping to sell, even though you vowed never to buy a car. I'm hoping we will be able to sell some of them and need some spare parts. But they might be made right in the village where I might need that spare part. Or an artisan might upgrade their output and their products using 3D printing and directly sell to the world or to the other cities in India. So I think we have to challenge the notion that productivity cannot be improved in smaller urban agglomerations. I think Mahindra is putting its money where its mouth is by creating these kinds of smaller agglomerations. Mahindra World City, Jaipur and Chennai are experiments in that direction. And I want to end with the idea of community. I know Amitabh said he didn't have enough time to talk about that, but he said that's important. We've learned the hard way. Anita and Sangeeta will remember when we put up Mahindra World City, Chennai. To be honest, we did it as if we were playing SimCity, you know, a kind of game that we were playing, and here's your work area, here's your living area, here's the hospital, and it was just a Lego set of things that we had put together. We forgot about how do you build community? What are the intangibles you build? How do you get people to come in and build a nightlife? It's not by just plotting things on a map. And I would dare say Sangeeta's goal right now is to build those. So what's as important for her as building a hospital? It's creating a marathon, which occurs in Mahindra World City, Chennai, to draw people together. Creating a signature artistic event. Those are the kinds of things that we have to do, which will restore a sense of community and identity. And those are best done in smaller agglomerations. You had a chart, I think, item of citizen to citizen was your last item. The most critical. One of the investments I've made personally is in a small startup called Local Circles here, which is about citizen to citizen contact to bring transparency and accountability in governance. That, combined with smaller agglomerations and the restoration of community, plus technology that allows you to be global and productive, I think that's where the future of cities lie. So may 1,000 cities bloom is what I say.
So if I could start with you, Meenakshi, as you do your work on looking at the fabric of where we have in the cities today and imagining what could it be, how do you think about that? What is your design philosophy, if you will?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here and to talk about my experience in New York. And so New York it's the global capital of the city, of the world, and it has a booming economy. Its population is on the rise, and perhaps many people think it doesn't have inherent issues that continue to plague it, but it does. And I just want to talk a little bit about those. But some of the conversations I've been hearing about whether they should be smaller cities or larger cities. In the U.S. context, I think there's great opportunity to densify existing urban centers and really capitalize on existing infrastructure as well as its building stock. I think one of the things that we can think about in terms of the existing environment is that it reflects the history of places and embodies the identity of cities and metropolises. So I think it has a real connection to its population and citizens. And that's something that's difficult to replicate when you talk about new centers. And I think the suburbanization of America sort of speaks to that. So New York has always had a culture of innovation, of progress, of reinvention, and of evolution. And it continues to modernize. It's about 400 years old, and it has different layers of history. And it continues to modernize, but its existing built fabric hasn't been put to the wayside, but it continues to be protected. And over the last 50 years, since protections were put in place for historic sites and neighborhoods, we have seen that in fact the preservation of these neighborhoods, they stabilize neighborhoods, they spur economic development, they promote tourism, education, recreation, welfare, and they foster civic pride. So I think that in a case like New York, which needs to be competitive, how do you balance both existing fabric and allow growth to take place? And I want to give an example of New York Central Business District, which is East Midtown. It's the largest central business district in the world, and in the eastern portion it has about 60 million square feet of office development, about 250,000 jobs, and it's home to many of the Fortune 500 companies. The area developed in the turn of the 20th century when the Grand Central Terminal, which is the major transportation hub and infrastructure of New York City, connecting to all the 5 boroughs, but also to the region, particularly to the north and along the east coast of commercial centers. So it developed in the turn of the century, and right now it's doing very well, but when we think about in the future, how does it remain competitive? And I think for city planners, we have to contend with 2 issues. One is that the district itself has no land, and in fact that's one of the issues. Businesses are coming to the area, but they're relocating outside of New York because there's no space to build. The second thing is that the existing building stock is old. It's about 100 years old, and it may not be able to accommodate modern commercial needs and also be able to incorporate modern technologies and building systems. So one of the things that New York City did was to think about how do we plan for the future of this area to remain competitive, and how do we balance both growth and preservation. And so it really was an integrated strategy, and my agency, what we were tasked to do was look at the area and identify historic resources and analyze them, and we concluded that within a very small area, which is about 75 blocks, we already had 38 buildings that were landmarked, and they represented 3 development phases in the area. we did further analysis and identified 12 additional buildings that we felt should be protected. And that would make a sum total of 50 buildings within the small area, which would really ensure that for future generations you will always be able